It is June 217 BCE, and just 6 months after his defeat of Sempronius Longus at Trebia, Hannibal was preparing to inflict yet another crushing blow on the Romans on the shores of Lake Trasimene. Hannibal's victory over consul Sempronius Longus at the Battle of Trebia in December 216 BCE had sent shockwaves through Rome. The Senate immediately set about raising new troops to replace those lost to the enemy, so when the campaigning season began in the spring of 217 BCE, the newly elected consuls were able to take command of fresh legions. 2 consular armies consisting of 4 legions, and possibly some of the survivors from Trebia, were positioned to stop Hannibal's southwards advance. The Italian peninsula is divided down the middle by the Apennine Mountains, so one army was placed on either side to block both routes south. Consul Gaius Flaminius rushed to join his army at Arretium, while his co-consul Gnaeus Servilius Gemellus was on the eastern side of the mountains on the Adriatic coast. Hannibal couldn't afford to waste his army fighting frontal battles, and he certainly didn't want to allow the 2 Roman armies to come together. He needed to defeat them separately, and to do that he would once again take his army into the mountains to outmaneuver his enemy. This time he took his entire army across the Apennines and down into the Arnos Valley in Etruria. At this time of the year the valley was flooded, and it took his army several days to cross the impassable marshes. The move was audacious and risky, but it succeeded in completely surprising the Romans. Hannibal's army then proceeded to plunder the rich farmland of the Arno Valley, replenishing stocks of food and looting and razing the villages and small towns in their path. They also executed all the adult males encountered. All of this was a calculated move to enrage the Romans in Arretium and force them to react instead of waiting to merge with the other consular army in the east. The Carthaginian army marched past Arretium in full sight of the Roman army there, and the Romans, of course, duly gave pursuit. What Flaminius didn't realise was this was exactly what Hannibal wanted, and he was playing into the hands of the wily Carthaginian general. Approaching Lake Trasimene, Hannibal quickly spotted an opportunity to use the terrain to his own advantage. He marched his army along a narrow strip of land between the shore of the lake and the wooded hills further to the north. By this stage the Romans were just a day behind, and this close pursuit would be their undoing. At this point it is worth pointing out that there are 2 possible locations for the battle, both of which seem to be supported by the written accounts of Livy and Polybius. One site on the north-east shoulder of the lake is topographically identical to the descriptions, but doesn't seem large enough to accommodate the strung-out Roman column. The other site is that favoured by modern archaeologists. It is much larger, and while the shoreline has differed considerably in 2 millennia, it is the most likely location for the battle. There is a large, relatively flat and low-lying area of farmland, with wooded hills forming a massive amphitheatre with a narrow entrance and exit at each end. When the Romans continued their close pursuit of the Carthaginians the next day, the low-lying land by the lake was shrouded in fog. But that was fine. They knew exactly where the enemy were, and if they were quick they could catch them up and force a battle. What they failed to realise was that they were walking into possibly the largest ambush in military history. Hannibal's plan was both simple and audacious. He marched his army through the valley and pitched a highly conspicuous camp at the far end, with lots of campfires to ensure the Romans knew exactly where they were. Then, during the night, he doubled back, placing his troops in the wooded hills overlooking the valley and parallel to the road the Romans would take the next morning. The scene is now set for our battle, and in order to replicate the fog-bound confusion of the Romans in this battle, all units start the game in march formation and unaware of the enemy, represented here by black tokens. However, at the start of each Roman turn, all units roll to test to see if they become aware of the enemy and the danger they are in. If they succeed, on a roll of 8, 9, 10 on a d10, they are free to change orientation on their activation. Given the starting distances of the respective sides, each Roman unit will therefore get 3 or more awareness rolls before the Carthaginians reach them. The game begins when the Romans reach the Carthaginian roadblock of heavy infantry. The Romans begin to deploy, expecting to break through what they think is the enemy's rearguard. Most of the column behind them wait patiently for the route to clear, but some units become nervous and respond to noises in the fog by turning to face inland. Up in the surrounding hills overlooking that shallow valley, the Carthaginian forces can see the Roman battle standards sticking up out of the fog and can tell when the right time to launch their move is, and so they begin to march through the fog and towards the distant enemy. Once in the fog, of course the Carthaginian forces are as blind as the Romans, so I only allow them to march straight forward, and of course if the Romans change position, the Carthaginians won't know anything about it until they get within eye contact through the fog. In all other respects I'm rolling for activation as per the to the strongest rules. Despite the fact that the fog will create confusion on both sides, the Carthaginians have the advantage of being able to pick where they land their main attack and use the slower response of the Romans to their advantage. In this case, the Carthaginian cavalry sweep round to block the exit route, the direction that the Roman army has appeared from. If they can get down into contact, they can eliminate the rear units of the Roman column before the rest of the army is even aware that they are under attack. Hannibal's Spanish cavalry quickly reach the rear units of the Roman column. Meanwhile, the head of the snake begins to engage with the Carthaginian heavy infantry blocking the road out of the valley. More Roman units turn to face noises in the fog, but some still remain unawares of what is happening and are in march column waiting for their route to clear so they can continue their pursuit of the Carthaginians and their allies. The Spanish and Punic cavalry quickly overwhelmed the rear units of the Roman column. Most of these Roman units had become aware of the ambush in time and were able to turn to face the threat, but the Carthaginian cavalry have been able to concentrate their focus on one point and before the Romans could redeploy fully. Some units in the Roman line are aware of the threat and turn to face the fog. Flaminius, who is with them, quickly changes position so that he can alert an adjacent unit, but unfortunately much of the Roman line still remains oblivious to the danger it is in. Back at the entrance of this amphitheatre of death, the Punic and Spanish cavalry have managed to completely overwhelm the rearward Roman units, blocking off the exit, meaning that the Romans can only go in one direction now. If they can break through the Roman heavy infantry at the head of the column, they may stand a chance. Unfortunately for the Romans, they are facing some of the best Spanish and North African infantry, heavy infantry, that the Carthaginians have placed before them, and the battle is not going well for them. Meanwhile, large Celtic warbands have begun to engage the centre and use their momentum to pin the Romans in place. A couple of Roman units are caught in the flank as confusion and panic begins to grip the trapped legions and their auxiliaries. Casualties begin to mount on both sides, but with both ends of the Roman line being squeezed and pushed back, the survivors of the Roman force are being pushed into a smaller and smaller mass surrounded by the Carthaginians and their allies. Casualties continue to mount on both sides, but the Romans have already lost too much ground and too many men. When the army's resolve finally breaks, the only escape route is into the marshy foreshore of the lake. Defeat quickly becomes a massacre. Lake Trasimene cements Hannibal's place in history as one of the greatest generals. Like Trebia before and Cannae later, he achieved victory because he was able to read the enemy, anticipate and even dictate their decision making. From the moment Flaminius left Arretium to pursue the Carthaginians, Hannibal had the initiative and used it ruthlessly to his own advantage. But this battle was also another example of Hannibal's exemplary fieldcraft. He was able to quickly identify the best location for the battle he wanted, combine that with his understanding of how the Romans would behave, and then deploy his forces at night and over unfamiliar ground to position them for the following day's ambush. Flaminius had played into Hannibal's hands, but in my game the Romans fought bravely and stubbornly to the end. However, with both ends of their line of march overwhelmed and confusion making an effective response difficult, they always had a near impossible fight. My game played out close to the historical narrative.